Welcome to House to Home, a podcast of Family Policy Alliance Foundation. I'm Joseph Kohm, the Policy Director here at FPAF, and with me as always is my FPAF colleague, Grace Youngson. And today we're going to talk about a new bill proposed in California called Assembly Bill 727, introduced in California, that would force LGBTQ advocacy on every student in the state with no exemptions for religious schools. So Grace, why don't you take us through this story and what this bill is proposing?
Yes, so a new bill introduced by Assemblyman Mark Gonzalez, a member of the California LGBTQ caucus, is poised to impose LGBTQ advocacy on every public and private school in the state. Assembly Bill 727 mandates that all 7 through 12 schools, both public and private, as well as public and private universities, print the contact information of an LGBTQ advocacy organization called the Trevor Project on every student identification card. Most concerningly, the bill offers zero exemptions for religious schools that hold faith-based objections to the ideological positions promoted by this private organization. And the Trevor Project is one of the most well-known, influential, and well-funded LGBTQ advocacy groups in the country. So this is pretty huge, Joseph. What is your first reaction to this story?
Yeah, you're right. This is a big deal and quite the government imposition, I must say. Before I give you my initial reaction, Grace, we just want to thank our State Family Policy Council, California Family Council, for their blog post summarizing this bill. Grace, you did a great job summarizing it, but I want to acknowledge the CFC folks, and we're just indebted to them for their work summarizing this bill for us in a blog post that you can find on the California Family Council website. But Grace, like you said, this is kind of shocking and quite the imposition. So my first reaction, honestly, FPA's been using a phrase in our Help Not Harm advocacy called the school to clinic pipeline. And that's what this is. This is the school to clinic pipeline that we've been trying to raise the alarm about throughout our Help Not Harm advocacy. And by school to clinic, we mean any school below college to the gender transition clinic where kids get transitioned. And we can say that because the research shows that over 90% of kids who are allowed to socially transition in school end up following all the way through with actual physiological transition. So that's puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then the actual mutilating surgeries in a vain attempt to try to transition into the other sex. So that's what this is, allowing the Trevor Project to be advertised on the back of a school document that every student has to carry. It's just perpetuating that school to clinic pipeline.
I totally agree. And I think that what's especially sad about it is because it's under the guise of suicide, you're really taking advantage of very troubled youths, and they need our compassion and help, not to be led down a path that is just going to destroy their entire lives. But when you're in that vulnerable state, it's so difficult to think clearly, or you're thinking, oh my goodness, these people care about me. My school is recommending them as a resource for me to reach out to. And I think it's just so deceptive.
Indeed. It reminds me of a phrase I've heard bantered about recently in some Christian circles called weaponized empathy. Because empathy, as we know, Grace, is a good thing. It's something that comes from God and that we should have for people who are vulnerable and struggling with thoughts of self-harm. But for activists to weaponize that against us and say, if you're empathetic about people struggling with gender dysphoria, that means you have to be in favor of this. Well, that's not true, and it means you have to get into the question of what does it mean to actually express that empathy you rightly feel in a positive way. And I just don't think that this is it. So I think there are also some First Amendment concerns here, Grace. So this would be forcing, there's no exceptions in this bill for public or private schools below the college or university level. And a lot of those private schools are religious schools. So the Trevor Project is this massive, massive activist group for the LGBTQ agenda, one of the biggest groups that does this worldwide. So for a religious school that has traditional convictions about sexuality and the way we're called to steward desires we're given, whatever those desires may be, to print information about a group like that that so openly opposes that school's values on the back of their students' ID card, the most vulnerable participants in the school, it seems to me that could be a real First Amendment violation that we should be concerned about.
Absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree, and it's really good that you brought that point out because more and more religious freedom, freedom of speech is just under such attack in America. And this really comes back to our calling as believers as well. This is obviously about this whole situation, vulnerable kids, LGBTQ, dangerous ideology, but this is also about are calling as believers to protect the gospel being shared in the US and to prevent kids from being exposed to evil. I mean, it reminds me of the porn situation as well. It's like when you're a kid who's young, who doesn't know any different, you're exposed to this, it's difficult to see clearly or understand what's actually going on, and then it's like now damage has been done and we're going to have to help you out of that, but what if we could have prevented that in the first place? And so I think it's super important, and it's also a complete violation of parents' rights as well,
Mhm.
because parents have a right as to how their children are educated, and to force this upon schools to have to print this on ID cards, something that every single kid has, is completely violating the parents' right as to having that supervision over what their children are exposed to. And parents are the ones who first and foremost care for their children and obviously raise their children, and according to God's plan are the ones who should have um that authority when it comes to decision making. And so that's a huge thing, and for parents listening to this, this is something that is really important to have your eyes open to.
Well, especially because dealing with suicidal thoughts and self harm ideation is a medical issue. And the constitutional right that parents had to direct the upbringing of their children includes all medical decisions, all physiological or psychological interventions to prevent harm and to get children healed. And we all know the Trevor Project wants every kid who feels discomfort in their sexual identity to be transitioned into that alternative sexual identity. That is also a physiological medical intervention. It's not a neutral thing. So parents should be the ones directing those decisions. And this law doesn't give parents the opportunity to opt out of having the Trevor Project's hotline printed on the back of their ID cards. So to me, it seems like a clear parental rights issue that would have to be worked out if the law were to be passed. And Grace, I liked your focus on the vulnerability of these kids because I don't want that to be lost on our audience. I mean, just for a second, put yourself in the place of a child of maybe middle school or high school years and how difficult those years are already, even if you don't have any questions or doubts about who God made you, and then to be dealing with to be dealing with confusion like that on that level where you're thinking about harming yourself. I mean, just what an awful situation to be in. These poor kids and their poor parents having to, have kids struggling with that and just be having their hearts broken for them. And something like this would make them more vulnerable in my mind. In fact, one of the issues that California Family Council highlighted about this bill is that it would endanger kids to online predator risks in the spaces of the Trevor Project. So, in fact, they even cite the Santa Ana Unified School Board. A member and former teacher investigated the online chat rooms at the Trevor Project and exposed some real risks to minors. She found that their platform, called Trevor Space, interesting play on the old platform MySpace, connected vulnerable youth with unverified adults in private chat rooms under the guise of offering support. So if I'm a parent, that is deeply concerning in the age of examples like Sage and Michelle Williams in Virginia, where through an adult transgender chat room, a girl was sexually trafficked from Richmond, Virginia to Baltimore, Maryland to Austin, Texas, and then was finally restored to custody of Michelle Williams, her grandmother in Virginia. I mean, this seems like it would open up the door to lots more tragic cases like Sage's. So that just seems like a clear challenge to me, Grace. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I just appreciate how you highlighted the vulnerability there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think every single one of us can identify with feeling a time in our life or several times where, you've felt vulnerable, something's happened. And it's like those people who you go to in that moment of vulnerability are so pivotal in how you move forward out of that. And, as believers, you surround yourself with people who love the Lord and therefore care about you and love you. And so, in those moments of vulnerability, whether that is just dealing with like negative self worth or dealing with temptation, you're going to surround yourself with those good people. I think about how that would be if you were surrounded by people who are actually preying on that vulnerability. Like that to me is just very scary and is also the height of evil and is really the way we see everything when we think about the abortion issue. You're just preying on girls in such a fearful moment in their lives. This issue, you're preying on these young kids. They're considering suicide. Like they're considering ending their lives because that's how sad they are. And now we're going to allow them to be exposed to even more dangerous ideology. I just think that it's really sad, really concerning, and the vulnerability aspect of it is huge, and it's huge from the standpoint of concern for children. But to me, it also just shows extremely clearly that these people really don't care about these children, because this is like a really sick marketing ploy, basically, where they have identified young kids who are susceptible to their messaging because they're in a vulnerable spot.
Yeah. I have a great senior pastor at my home church, Wave Church here in Virginia. Pastor Steve Kelly loves to say every new religion wants to get into children's ministry, which I find really powerful and a reminder that so much of what we see of alternative ideologies that profess not to be religiously linked really are, because they put in their crosshairs kids who, even if they're perfectly mentally healthy, kids are by nature the most vulnerable members of our communities and our countries. And I think that in a roundabout way, Grace, I actually find it a bit encouraging. I think our audience should be too, because it means we already know that God has a particular focus on vulnerable groups of people, and that should be more significant to people, because God had to become vulnerable to save us. When He died on the cross, it was the ultimate experience of vulnerability. So God has, throughout the Bible and throughout history, you see God in the church's unique focus on vulnerable people. So I don't think it should be surprising to people that ideologies that are opposed to the truth about the Bible and about the way God made the world should go after the most vulnerable in today's world. So that should let us know we're doing the right thing. We're over the target here, and these kids are worth defending. So the last thing I'll say before we move on to our next segment is just that, to me, this seems like a very coercive policy from the government. And recently, President Trump enacted an executive order called or on ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schooling. This bill seems like it would stand in direct opposition to that, because the order specifically aims to eliminate, and I quote, federal funding or support for illegal and discriminatory treatment and indoctrination in K through 12 schools, including based on gender ideology and discriminatory equity ideology, end quote. That would be like DEI. So this kind of falls into that. And to me, that sets up a direct conflict of laws between the EO and the proposed law. And all that would do was waste the taxpayers of California, would waste their dollars defending a law that is in direct conflict with that executive order. So it seems like trouble to me, Grace.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. Joseph, we always like to articulate the argument from the other side to give them a fair voice. And hopefully, as they hear us articulate the argument, they would say, "Yep, that's the way I think about this." Can you provide us some articulation of that?
Yeah, I'd love to. This is one of my favorite topics, because FPA is a nonpartisan, and we like to say bipartisan organization, or FPAF is. So we work with people from across the political spectrum, um, and we want to make sure we can address the concerns of every perspective on this issue. So I would summarize the arguments in favor of a bill like this as succinctly as I can this way. We are being insensitive when we refuse to provide gender affirming care to youth. We're being transphobic when we refuse to allow groups such as the Trevor Project to be advertised. And adding this hotline information will help reduce suicide in a population group that is already at increased risk of suicide. So I've got some counter arguments prepared for this, Grace, but because we've talked so much about suicide already, I'm going to lead with that, with countering that last bit, because it is so important. I mean, there are lives at stake. I want to make sure we properly assess the suicide risk here, because this other side loves to say, what I just wrote, that this is a group at increased risk in suicide, and that gender affirming care, like you would get from the Trevor Project, helps reduce that risk. Well, we know from the research that that's not true. Gender affirming care, at the very least, does not help alleviate self-harm ideation or suicidal thoughts in a vulnerable group of people like those struggling with gender dysphoria. In fact, this came up very recently in arguments in a Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Skermeti. This case will decide the fate of all help not harm laws in the country. And social transitioning and other forms of gender affirming care were admitted by opposing counsel from the ACLU, not to reduce suicide in this vulnerable population group. This was drawn out by Justice Alito in the oral arguments. If our audience is interested in this, I highly recommend they go listen to that section. But Justice Alito very tactfully drew this out of Chase Strangio, who was the lawyer for the ACLU in this case. And Mr. Strangio admitted to Justice Alito on the record during oral arguments that gender affirming care and social transitioning do not reduce suicide in this population. So at the very least, what this bill is trying to do, it would not achieve that objective. I think that's important. That's important to know when we talk about suicide and self-harm in gender dysphoric youth. So, but Grace, what else should we say in response to this argument?
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm glad that you brought that out, that it's like whatever, they're trying to sell this as a solution to suicide, and it's the exact opposite. We're just leading them further down that road. And I think it's interesting, we can even look at stories. Chloe Cole is very famous for her story with regards to this exact thing happened to her, where she was, a young girl having insecurities about what gender she was, and then ended up going down this pipeline, ended up having transition surgeries and all these things, and now as a young woman, and I think Chloe and I must be a similar age, she now regrets everything that happened. I mean, her voice is changed. I think she had a double mastectomy, and I think as a woman, like for me, I know like it's even just different parts of yourself, even your hair or whatever it is, like it all contributes to part of your sense of beauty as a woman, and I think it's just so sad that we're doing such a disservice to children. And it's like we wouldn't let a child get a tattoo, but somehow we would let them change themselves forever. And so when we're talking about this, we're not just saying, oh, this could happen, this could have negative effects. No, there are real life stories of young people. And Chloe Cole is just one of many. And I'm sure there's many, many, many more who also just haven't been bold enough to speak up, and who also are just still stuck in this deception. I know people personally who are stuck in this kind of thing, and they are consistently depressed and sad, and it's so sad and in a sense frustrating to me that that was allowed in at that young age, at that vulnerable time. But yeah, I think it's very useful to note, there are real life people who this affects, and that is exactly why we're talking about this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Grace. Chloe Cole's a hero. She's on our website. She's been a great hero of the detransitioner movement. So I would encourage our audience, if you don't know who she is, do a Google search, because she's an American hero in my mind. So I appreciate you bringing her up, Grace. I think the last thing I might say here is that to me, this is another example of classic, what we would call cronyism, which is when the government gets in bed with either a favored industry or a favored interest group to oppose large groups of its citizens by forcing that special interest on them, and ending up making life worse for them. This is the government getting in bed with the Trevor Project if it were to be enacted, and I think we're all generally opposed to that, even for interests that we like. If you're going to convince people to adopt your interest, you should do just that. Convince them to do it on their time. Doing something like this imposes a special interest group's ideology on the rest of its citizens. And I think as social conservatives, we generally oppose that kind of cronyism. So, Grace, any final thoughts?
I think we really covered this pretty well. I don't think I have anything further to add. I think this has been really good and really important to cover.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad we've covered this. Thanks again to our friends at California Family Council. They are one of 40 plus state family policy councils, which you can find on fpaf.com/allies. If you're not connected to your state family policy council, we encourage you to do that. They're great groups doing great work like this that we are reliant on for this show. So thanks to the CFC folks for that. And finally, thanks to our audience for listening to this episode of House to Home, a podcast by Family Policy Alliance Foundation. I've been Joseph Kohm alongside Grace Youngson. We're here every week these days. Find the latest episode everywhere you get your pods and connect with FPAF on social media. Our handles will be in the show description, as well as a link to this blog post from CFC. So thank you all for listening. We will see you again next week.